Wonder your knee feels terrible, right? Look at that. So this is the equivalent, this is important, and this will be a nice little soundbite. This is the equivalent of, in this position, I'm missing, let's just say, this would be generous, half of the available range of motion of the leg. And can you imagine if I walked around and I was like, I can only bend my elbow this much. Is that a problem? And then you were like this. I'm going to feed myself. Why do I have a neck problem and wrist problem? Well, it's fine. I can barely get my face there. Right? Well, that's what's happened in your leg. But somehow, because it's downstream, we're like, it's fine. I can do friend. Whatever. I totaled on Wednesday, right? But that's all you've got there, bro. And so, what's happening to your hip, right? And what we want to do is make sure that you can close that joint all the way down. And we just don't think about that as obvious because we don't feed ourselves with our feet and legs. But that's pretty bad, right? So the question is, what are you doing about it? And the answer is, I do some dynamic range of motion, which is allowing you to train. But there's, I take an athlete like this, let's flip over on your back, and I think to myself, wow, here's a guy who can get a lot faster. Here's a guy who's, can potentially solve his own dysfunction with just some simple immobilization. And no wonder you're having, you end up getting a little bit tight towards the end of the day, right? There's a bunch of other tests we could look at. We could look at psoas. I'll tell you, let's do Thomas test. Scoot on down here for me. How about the edge? Okay, so what I'm going to have you do is scoot all the way to the edge, and then I want you to pull your left knee to your chest, and then lay back for me. So hold this left knee. Good. And then can you scoot yourself all the way to the edge here for me? Right? Yeah, and what we're trying to do is just keep his back in neutral, and this helps me to kind of just take a look at, is TFL tight? We're looking at his tensor fascia lata, how high the leg is, says something about his psoas, and it says it's a little bit tight. We'd like to see kind of perfect 90-90-90. And then this leg kind of extending out is rectus femoris being tight. So it's a quick, easy kitchen table assessment to kind of look at kind of this anterior, chain musculature. Let's go to the other knee to chest. So this is the affected hip, but the affected knee. And you can see clearly that we have an imbalance side to side. Can you see that? Absolutely. So in this position, you can see that his rectus femoris is a little bit tighter, right? Psoas is still tight. And, we wind that up. Oh, what's that feel like? Morning. Yeah, right. So let's figure out a couple hip openers for you, and we'll retest, okay? So internal rotation and flexion. What are my options? Well, I'm going to show you. Hop up real quick. What I'm going to have you do is come up on the table, a bed surface where I can drop the leg off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take myself into flexion, challenge the position, and in this case it's internally rotating. So the femur is rotating in. I'm hooking my foot, and then I'm going to push back into that hip. So I'm going to bring my knee to relative midline here, and then I'm going to just oscillate in and around, and the image is me trying to shove my femur through my butt. So in this position, I'm just going to bring that knee to the midline of my body. I'm in internal rotation, relative internal rotation of the femur, and then I'm just going to be rigid. I'm not going to close down because in this position, now I have to be a little bit more mindful of my back. I'm not being supported. And so in this, I'm going to just push this around and be like, oh, that's where I'm restricted. Feels like there's an ice pick hitting me there. And that part of that capsular ligament is the piece that tends to restrict that internal rotation. So I'm just oscillating in and out of resistance right there. Keep pushing out, keep pushing out. I can change that all the way up here. I can kind of sweep around, but that is how you're going to get into that internal rotation. Give it a try. So is that the affected hip? It is. Yep. So start in this neutral position. Go ahead and shift your weight over. So we want to bring this knee to the middle of the table so you don't fall off. Good. And then I want you to shift over. And what we're going to imagine is sticking your femur out through your butt. Can you do that? You feel that? Yeah. Okay. So come forward now and come out to the side, and you really feel how that gets tight. And if I imagine rotating your hips down, you can really feel how that starts to wind up there, yeah? You can feel that? Knee is protected, no problem on the knee. So now let's bias this position. So go ahead and hook over. Now you're in relative internal rotation. Now back that up, and you see how quickly that gets tight. Do you feel that here?
Yeah.
And in a little more. Good. That's what I want. So you can spend time there. That's like a hard block there, right? It feels like that's going to tear. If I went further than that, you would yell brisket. right? So go ahead and see if you can't push yourself into that position and spend some time oscillating. I'll anchor down the table. So the femur's in relative internal rotation. We've got his hip in deflection, and he's just going to oscillate back and forth and try to mobilize that hip. Now I want you to do this. Look at me. I want you to rotate your hips down and try to do an anterior pelvic tilt. So I want you to tilt and close this hip angle down further. So kind of come down onto your knees and see if you can close this hip angle down. Does that make sense? So now I want you to drop down on your elbows and see if you can come further, closing. There you go. 3, 2, 1, instant feedback. You feel that in there? Yeah, and that's just the gristle. You know, and of course we can talk about what part of the capsule that is. And typically one of the things that's happening in a lot of athletes who are, you know, well developed in big strong squats is they have this cam impingement of the hip, where the hip is rolling up and actually running into the femur's running into the acetabulum, into the hip capsule socket. And one of the ways we cue this to correct is to get our athletes to get their knees out. You know, that's one of the reasons you can maintain a much more upright torso when you're squatting. You know, with that knee further out, because you're not getting pulled back and reversing. So when athletes overextend, they close this angle off even earlier. But what we want to do is see if we can't change the onset of that impingement. So on your back. So that was about, I don't know, 90 seconds, 2 minutes of that business. Let's go ahead and reassess. So do we have any internal rotation change? Yeah, absolutely. So we went from maybe 5 degrees to what? Something that looks more akin to where we need to be, right? And so that's going to significantly unload that knee. And I haven't done anything. I've just, again, reiterated that, hey, let's get you mobilizing in that position of restriction. You know, so you saw Leaf doing that piece. He basically brought the knee to midline, winds up that capsule, brings that foot out a little bit. He oscillates back and forth. And that would almost look like what I would try to do. Do not try this at home unless you're a PT. I take him into hip quadrant. I have approximation through the leg. I add the internal rotation, and then I oscillate in and out. And what does that feel like? Is it a more intense version of what you just did? Yeah, absolutely. Is it as effective what he's doing, what I'm doing? No way. But is it a way for him to start treating himself and thinking about his dysfunction? Absolutely. So you saw how much change we made. I'm just going to spend a second in here working. Again, I'm just taking him into those positions of restriction and then oscillating, and I've felt a few hips in my lifetime. Again, taking some liberties with this athlete. Much better range there. And then we look at his internal rotation now, right? I would say, hey, that's normal, right? You don't have an internal rotation problem. So, you know, let's take a look at your squat on this side now that we've just spent some time on that internal rotation. Yeah, it feels like a little Wolverine has been gnawing at your hip. That's good. It's part of the Wolverine complex. And so now we're looking at, again, you know, the weighting, and you can see how much better everything is in line here. And so not only are we unloading those tissues, because now he can actually keep it out there, and do you see how he defaulted back to that old motor pattern? Shove your knee out further. Look at that. He can go much further out now than he did before. Right? And now, I mean, that's overcorrection, but now we can actually get him accessing this part of his active hip complex, so the active hip position that Ripito is talking about, where I have a much better length-tension relationship, and then I've decreased how much torque is about the knee. And the reason this matters is that if I can get him into a better mechanical position, what ends up happening? Yeah, he lifts more weight, right? We just shaved 10 seconds off his Fran time, and those are free seconds. Is that feeling different in that hip?
Yeah.
Shocking, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right. So, you know.
Yeah.
You know, give a man a squat. He squats for a day. Teach him to squat. Wait, how does that work? Something about fishing and squatting. I'm not sure. But you know, the key is, unless you can see change or experience change, there's no change. You know, let's get you starting to think about. And of course, it helps when someone guides you through this process. But you can still see he's not comfortable. He still wants to default into this position. And if he gets tired, he still will default. You know, this new range comes new responsibility. But that's much better through that hip. Right. Do you agree?